Today, we're going to talk about the one thing that is preventing you from living the life of your dreams, from living a life of fulfillment, from having all of the emotional experiences that you want to have, and from really being able to connect with people. And that one thing that's preventing all of that from happening is your ego. So, today on the Spohn Train podcast, we're going to talk about what your ego is, how it affects you, and how you can start to overcome it to live a life of fulfillment, a life of connection, and a life of real sustainable happiness. Now, these are big claims because the ego is something we are never taught about and we never really understand, especially in our Western Christian culture. We never learn about what is the ego? How does it affect us? So today we're going to tackle that issue. And a lot of what I know about the ego is from one of my favorite books, and it is Satan, an Autobiography. So I just reached out to the author. I'm working on getting him on the podcast. But for right now, we're going to talk about my interpretation of this book. And so basically, what is the ego and why do we have it? So in the book, he talks about in the beginning, there was God. And in this beginning, there was just total love and bliss and euphoria, right? Because that's what God is. And God created a soul to keep him company. And this soul was so filled with God's love and God's presence that it never had any contrast. It couldn't experience gratitude. It couldn't appreciate what it really had because it never had contrast, right? Like contrast is what creates real joy and happiness and gratitude in our life, because if we didn't have lack, when we got something, we wouldn't appreciate it. If it was sunny all the time, we wouldn't appreciate it, right? It's those rainy days and those cold days that make the spring and the summer feel so good and so sweet. And so in the beginning, there's God and this soul, and there's only this amazing connection. And so the soul says, in order to really feel gratitude, appreciation, and connection to God, it decides to go on a journey. And this journey is to separate itself from God. And so it splinters into a bunch of different souls, which is you and me here today. And it goes on this journey. This is kind of the metaphorical Garden of Eden, when the soul decides to take the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and it separates itself into this experience where the ego is created. And the ego is what creates that illusion of separation from God. Now, again, it's just an illusion. We're going to come back to this multiple times, but the ego in our minds is what prevents us from being truly connected to God. So our journey here on earth is to overcome that ego. That's what enlightenment is shedding layers of the ego, layers of fear programming to become what we truly are, which is this divine nature and connected to God. And so there's several ways to do that. But first of all, let's get into a little bit more of what the ego is and what it does for us. Now, evolutionarily, of our lower nature, the ego is a survival mechanism, and it operates in several ways. For one, it creates an illusion of separation. So have this illusion that I'm separate from somebody else, from the energy of the earth, right? And in reality, we're all one. We're all one energy. People that have taken psychedelics, I've heard LSD, I've never done it, but there's this thing that gets created. It's called the web of life. And when you're on a psychedelic drug, a mind-altering drug, you see the connection between all things. And I've had some experiences through meditation, through some plant medicine retreats as well, where I've felt that connection to all things. And so that's what the ego prevents, is that feeling of connection. When you feel that separateness, you have your own identity. That's what the ego is. Now, the ego's goal is to protect its own identity and to allow you to survive physically in this life. Its goal is not to have you have this self-actualizing experience, to live an amazing and fulfilled life. That's not its goal. Its goal is survival. And a few ways it does that. One, it drives you for status. So as humans, status is survival. The more things that we have, the more people look up to us, the more approval we get from other people, the more likely we are to survive. So think about all those times when you've acted or not acted just to get people's approval, to make people like you. Those are all from the ego. And sustainable joy and fulfillment and progress does not come from those situations. Now, in our lower nature, it's a drive to survive, but in our higher nature, as we seek to evolve to become enlightened, it's overcoming all of those layers of programming to act without needing approval from anyone, to act not caring what your status is, not caring what anybody thinks of you. That's overcoming your ego. The ego has one of the little play on words here I use is less, loss, never. Anytime you have a thought of, I'm going to have less of something, I'm going to lose something, or I'm going to have a loss, or I'm never going to experience something. Those are always thoughts of scarcity, and they're always thoughts of the ego, because our higher selves knows that anytime we lose something, we're opening the door for something better to come to us. But the ego only sees that less, loss, never. My girlfriend broke up with me. Oh, I'm losing this. I'm never going to have the family I wanted. I'm going to have less love. I'm going to have less sex, whatever it might be. Anytime that thought, right? If a deal falls apart, oh, I'm going to have less money. I'm never going to accomplish financial freedom. Those are always thoughts of the ego. And remember, the ego is just an illusion. And once we realize that, we can start to overcome it. We can recognize it. Because for the ego, there's never enough, because it's driving to survive. We never have enough, right? If your ego is driving you to make money, guess what? You're never going to have enough money to feel abundant. You could be, they talk about people that have millions and billions of dollars. They never feel financially secure, because when it's coming from the ego, it's never enough. The ego's goal is survival, and that means seeking more, right? Does that make sense? So anytime you're driving from the ego, from survival, from approval, it's never going to be enough. And I realized this, I was speaking in Montreal a few weeks ago, and my talks went really well, but I realized they were, and I'm always seeking to enlighten people, to serve, to give great information. But I realized that above that and beyond that, I was really speaking for approval and recognition. And I did a pretty good job. I got a lot of approval and recognition. And then I came home, I live alone, and all that approval and recognition was gone. And so any little bump that I had emotionally in Montreal was totally wiped out when I came home. And I felt worthless. I felt like I wasn't good enough, because the illusion of the ego, and because my talk, a lot of what I did had come from the idea of getting recognition. And remember, that feeling, when it comes from the ego, is not sustainable. So I'm going to talk to you at the end on how to, what the best way is to overcome that ego, so you can have sustainable and fulfilled joy. All right. So then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is why we have the ego from an evolutionary perspective is the ego creates judgment. Remember, the ego shows us that we're separate from other things, the illusion of separateness, but it also creates judgment, because I talk about this, anytime I talk about rapport, I talk about judgment. Remember, rapport is being on the same energetic wavelength as someone, showing that you're like somebody, because people like themselves. So when we were in tribes, anytime someone was similar to us, right? They talked like us, they dressed like us, they had similar religion, similar accents, they were safe. They're part of our tribe. We're all working together to survive. And anytime we saw somebody different, they were a competitor for resources. They were a competitor for our hunting grounds, our women, our money and resources, and they were a competitor. So that judgment was a survival mechanism. So the ego, and it still does this to this day, anytime we see someone different, we immediately judge. Oh, that person's overweight. They look like a slob. They're a different race. They're dangerous. They're Democrats. They're Republicans. And we create this separation between us and them. And that's what prevents rapport. Remember, the ego is the idea of separation from our connectedness to the creator and our connectedness to everything. So anytime we judge, that's never your higher self. That's always your ego. And when you judge others, you also tend to judge yourself as well. So the ego creates judgment. We're going to talk about how to overcome that in a few minutes. And so the general idea here is, how do we go from this survival ego where we want status, we want approval, we want acceptance, we want to be selfish, into an enlightened state where we don't care what people think of us, where we're so secure in ourselves, where we're giving and we're selfless? How do we make that transition? And the ego, it does this thing. And, when people think about the ego, they think about someone that's egotistical. They think very highly of themselves. Well, that's part of it, right? As humans, oftentimes we think we're the most important human that was ever created in this world. And other times we often think, I'm not enough and I'm worthless. Well, both of those are illusion, and they're both from the ego. And so in a moment, we're going to talk about how to start recognizing that. But I think the main driver here is that the ego is always selfish. And so your spiritual growth is always going to be from a place of selflessness. So, I listened to Melissa Tiers, who's a famous hypnotist, and really into brain and neurology and neuroscience. And she talks about the part of the brain that recognizes that we're separate from other things. We can slow it down with hypnosis, with meditation. And imagine like if there's a part of our brain that is where the ego is held. Well, if we slow that down, we can start to recognize the oneness in everything. We can start to feel the connection in everything. And there's a few ways to do that. Like I said, hypnosis, psychedelics often do this, which is why we become so present and so grateful sometimes on psychedelics or on plant medicine. And the best way is just to be selfless. There's all kinds of studies out there that people that are giving are the most happy, because when you give, you're recognizing I'm putting someone else's needs ahead of mine. I'm serving others. That's telling my brain that I recognize the oneness in us, and the separation between us begins to dissolve. And so that part of our brain that recognizes that separation starts to slow down. The ego starts to dissolve anytime we do something selflessly. Now, if we serve others with the intention of getting recognition, that's not selfless, that's selfish. So your intention really matters. When you serve someone, not caring what you get back in return, the part of your brain that is the ego will start to dissolve. And you're going to feel true joy and true fulfillment in a sustainable way when you come from that place. Most people out there struggling emotionally are only struggling because they're worried about whom? Themselves. Right? If you're worried about yourself, it's never going to be enough. You're always going to feel stupid. You're never going to feel like you're accepted. But when you shift your thinking to focus on somebody else, to serving somebody else, whether in business or in conversation, it's going to give you sustainable energy and sustainable fulfillment. Because when our focus is on us, on criticizing and judging ourselves, we're always going to find a reason to do that, right? That's what the ego does. That's its goal. It makes you say, hey, look, you're stupid here. You look dumb here. Let's not put ourselves out there, right? And that's a survival, because if we get rejected, we aren't part of a tribe and we're going to die. That's what the ego tells us. But overcoming that, we say, no, we're going to put our attention on other people. We're going to let that line of separation begin to dissolve. We're going to serve others. We're not going to worry about how we look. We're going to put others' needs first. You will start to feel joy and fulfillment on a deep level. A couple of weeks ago, I heard Master Co, one of the people I look up to in pranic healing, and he talks about the soul grows by giving, not by accumulating. And think about all of the spiritual leaders, their whole the tradition, Jesus and Buddha. It's all built around selflessness and giving. And when you come from that place, the universe seems to open up to you. And I believe that your spiritual channel, your spiritual ability to attract things into your life grows exponentially. Because remember, if the ego creates fear, fear constricts your energy, it constricts your peripheral vision, it constricts your ability to digest, it constricts your perceptual filters. And when you start to shed those layers of ego, your perceptual filters open up, your ability to see patterns in the world, to be present, to connect with people grows exponentially. This is why the ego is what's holding you back in every area of your life. And it's like that little voice in our head that we often aren't conscious to. The whole illusion that he talks about in the book, Satan and Autobiography, is that Satan is our adversary, it provides us this contrast so we can see separation from God and we can feel connection to God, right? Without that contrast, we wouldn't have spiritual fulfillment and gratitude for God. So the illusion of that separateness, and when we start to overcome that, we find, again, that fulfilled place of being. I forgot where I was going with that. We'll come back to it. Selflessness. Lost my train of thought. Okay. Um, so here's a few ways to start to overcome the ego. The first way, I know where I was going. So the illusion is that our ego is us, right? The illusion is that Satan comes in and he sneaks into our brains and in our psyche, and he makes us think that his voice is our voice. It's our internal voice. Hey, don't do that. You're going to look stupid. Hey, let's worry about what other people think of us. Let's not do this. Oh, if this happens, we're going to have less of something. That's never your voice. And I always teach us, it's just like being dialed in to a radio station that you don't like. You would never watch a movie more than once that you don't like, do you? But what we do is we listen to that voice in our head that is our ego over and over, and we believe it. And then we think it's our voice. And it's absolutely crazy that we're never taught this, but that's not your voice. So the first step is to begin to have some self-awareness as to what is you and what is your ego. And the ego is always going to prevent you from loving, from feeling gratitude, from connecting with people and serving people on a deep level. So remember, anytime you have less, loss, never, anytime you have judgment about yourself, about others, that's always the ego. And so the first step, again, is self-awareness. How do we recognize that and say, oh, that's funny, that's my ego, let's get it out of here, and let's find a connection to my true and higher self. So the first step, again, is recognition. And how do we do that? A lot of times meditation is a great way. People say, I can't meditate because my mind gets full and I get distracted. Well, recognizing that is the goal. Now, we're always striving towards becoming, totally present where we don't have thoughts. But is that realistic? For most of us, no, it's totally not. Like I can go a couple seconds without having a thought. And I've been meditating for probably 10, 15 years. So the idea, but my practice is watching the thoughts. Because in meditation, if I can sit for 20 minutes, I can watch a thought come up and be like, oh, that's an interesting thought. That's not my thought. That's my ego. And I'll watch another thought come up. I'm not good enough. I have to do this. And I'll just let all those thoughts start to go. And I practice watching the thoughts without feeling them. I don't let those thoughts take over my body and give me feelings anymore because I'm observing them, right? Just like when we watch a movie, oftentimes we feel the emotions of the movie, even though they're not real. We're not really part of the movie. Why would we feel emotions about it? Again, that's what the ego does, is it makes us think that that movie is us, that it's our emotion. So when we meditate, we start watching those thoughts just like an observer instead of owning them, and we let them pass. And that's the entire goal for me most of the time of meditation, depending on what I'm working on. If it's self-hypnosis, it might be different. But when I'm meditating, I'm watching that thought. I'm saying, this isn't my thought. I'm letting it pass, watching the next thought come up. And then in daily life, there's a time lapse between stimulus and response. Most of us, something happens and we mindlessly respond to it, right? We're not conscious of it. We have this automatic response. We get angry, we get fearful, we get lazy. And this automatic response, which is our ego, takes over. But instead, with practice and meditation, we get to have a thought, we get to observe the thought, and then we get to decide. There's enough time in there to say, all right, is it going to serve me to be angry here? Is it going to serve me to be lazy here? Is it going to serve me to have take this action, to have this feeling? And most of the time, we just say no, right? You can't control your first thought, but you can control your second thought. So the ego is always going to be pushing thoughts up. It's just observing them and then choosing a new thought, which is going to be more empowering. All right, so self-awareness, watching the thoughts, a good way to do that is meditation. And the most important way we've already talked about to overcome your ego is selflessness, the intention of being selfless. Anytime you give to somebody, anytime you serve somebody else, that intention echoes out into the universe. And when you come from that place, your spiritual pipeline, as Master Co calls it, your spiritual pipeline begins to open up. You have more spiritual power. You're able to attract more things into your life. If you notice, if I pay close attention to what I call grace and synchronicity, those little coincidences in life that are really the universe delivering things to you and showing you that you're on track. And when you're giving, you are so much more open to those things. When you're selfish, you close yourself off to the universe conspiring to help you. And again, these are just my beliefs. This is, I talk about, it doesn't matter if a belief is true, it matters if it's empowering. And this is my belief that I choose because I think it's empowering. I don't know if the universe really works this way. I believe it does. And I think that serves me in a lot of ways. So again, that's what the ego does. It makes us think that we're separate from everything else. It creates the illusion of separateness from God. It causes us to judge others. It causes us to judge ourselves, just as a survival mechanism. It always tries to preserve itself. So when you're trying to overcome it, it's always going to fight you. And in the book, remember, it's an adversary. It's like an opponent that's going to cause contrast in our lives. Without a worthy opponent, we're not going to become our best selves. So the ego is really a tool for spiritual growth. It's like weights and going to the gym, but most of us don't know it. We're blind to the fact that we even have one, and we think it's us. That's the greatest trick the devil ever played, was making us think that our ego is ourselves, and it's not. Remember, we can observe it. We can let those thoughts go. Anytime we release judgment, anytime we act selflessly, we're overcoming that ego. And in doing so, we open our spiritual pipeline. We open ourselves to synchronicities from the universe. We open ourselves to more energy, because fear is what drains our energy, and the ego causes fear. So anytime we overcome fear, we can have more energy in our lives, more joy, more fulfillment, and more connection with others, because we stop worrying about what others think of us, and we stop worrying about how we look. So I hope this was enlightening. I would highly recommend this book. This is between 1 and 2. It's between this and Psycho-Cybernetics for my favorite books. And if you guys want to, reach out to the author, Yehuda Berg, and he's on Instagram, and tell him to join me on the podcast. Give him a little encouragement. I'm waiting to hear back from him, but I think he'd be an amazing guest. And if you haven't, follow me on Facebook. You can follow me at Nicholas Spohn. I just posted a video today about how our perceptual filters affect our world, how we generalize, delete, and distort based on our perceptual filters and beliefs. So to get content like that every day that's going to help change your mindset, change your life, follow me at Nicholas Spohn on Facebook. I think it's facebook.com/SpohnTrained, or you can join the Facebook group where there's more interaction, and that's going to be facebook.com/groups/SpohnTrained. So I hope this was an important lesson that's going to guide your personal development, because what I believe, what I teach, is that our personal development is just shedding layers of fear patterning and the ego to become our true selves, to become more filled with love, more filled with gratitude, and to create and interact from that space. That's at the heart of personal development. And most people don't get into the ego and how it prevents us from doing that. You know, we want to talk about body language and meditation and all these different things while ignoring the ego. But the ego is the single most important thing to understand when tackling personal development. I hope this was helpful. Again, check that book out. Join us on Facebook, and I can't wait to see you guys on the next episode. Have a great day.